Good morning, welcome back to episode 8 of my DC2 Integra Racecar build. It's been a couple of months since the last video. As usual, life gets in the way, but have been chipping away at a bunch of small things in the background. When we last left off, I'd pretty much completed all the wiring planning, so had done a giant spreadsheet to capture all the information and map everything out, and also had done a dummy loom just out of rope to figure out where everything runs in the car. Since then, have spent an inordinate amount of money on wiring materials, so that's all laid out, ready to go. That's this week's task, is to build the wiring loom. Lots involved in that. This is quite an expensive endeavour, but it's a lot of stuff that I can continue using for future projects, so good investment. All the materials, just got proper race spec wire in various gauges. Borrowed a heat shrink label printer off my friend Travis, thanks for that. That'll be super handy to label everything. And everything else is just connectors, little wiring ID tags, all sorts of bits and pieces that go into it. Outside of that, not a heap of progress on the car itself. I have done a fair bit of tidying up in the engine bay. First is the obvious one, is a brand new Type R valve cover, so that really cleans things up compared to the sort of pretty beat up old silver standard one. I've got a black dipstick ready for that as well. Get rid of that unsightly orange one. Installed radiator fan. That's a bit too close to the radiator hose, so I might actually put that on the front of the radiator instead. Done all the fuel lines. This is all nice, super fancy BMRS sort of convoluted Teflon tubing stuff with crimp fittings. Just from Wanted Motorsport here in Perth. Not the cheapest thing around, but also not that much more expensive than doing it with the cheap China stuff. And the end result is really fantastic. So it's a relatively complex setup with a bunch of lines going into and out of the surge tank. Got the flex fuel sensor down there, fuel filter running into the rail goes to fuel pressure regulator, then back to the return. Also on the firewall you can see I've got some bulkhead connectors. The large one is for the engine loom and the smaller one down the bottom is for the chassis loom. These are essentially the cheapest you can get. They're Deutsch HDP, they're sort of plastic bodied ones. They're still really expensive, but such a neat and good solution. Beauty about these is if you ever need to take the engine out, essentially it's just a click and away you go, the whole thing comes out. So looking forward to using those. I don't intend to take the engine out very often, but it is a really clean way to pass it through the firewall rather than just a big grommet like most people use. Also got a power stud coming through, so the positive battery cable will come through there. The battery will be mounted just inside the firewall, and that'll feed the alternator and starter motor, well, take from the alternator. Yeah, that's really about it for the rest of that. I think the interior is basically as we left it. I've designed some brackets to mount the dash and, well, AIM Solo data logger. It's not too much of a dash, but it does the job. And the 15 button CAN keypad, they'll be mounted directly off the cage and the steering column. So when those come in, I'll show you those too. That's about it for a project update. Basically now I'm going to start laying things out and get stuck into the wiring itself. Okay, so first step for me was to run all the battery cables. I didn't film that process because I didn't think it was going to take very long, but it's taken me half a day, which is bloody ages. Turns out it was fairly complex. It looks complex, looks very messy. I'll tidy this up with some cable management later. And the passenger footwell, whenever there are passengers in the car, they'll have like a foot box which prevents them from contacting all this anyway. The battery, which is a lithium motorcycle battery, that's obviously connected directly to the chassis as the ground, but also straight through to the Haltech Nexus as per their instructions. The PDM also needs to connect straight to the battery, but I'll do that later when I do the main harness because it's just smaller wires. And then I have a solid state battery isolator. It's a Tyco or TE branded isolator, which isolates the positive feed to the ECU and the PDM when the kill switches are pushed. But it does mean that the battery is always connected to the alternator, so that when you do kill the engine, that sort of overflow current, I guess, has somewhere to go rather than into the ECU. So yeah, not my proudest work. It doesn't look super great, but we'll hide all that behind some shiny aluminium foot boxes when we get to that point. Same deal in the engine bay. I've just run a cable. You can see there's a stud in the firewall there. That stud runs through, and then there's a cable that goes to the alternator and the starter motor. And I've got a couple of grounds running from the engine to the chassis as well. So that about covers it for the power side of things. Now I'll probably get started on some of the interior wiring, getting the harnesses ready for the rear lights and the fuel pump and all that stuff. Alright, update time. My garage is a complete mess, but that's all good. I'm making some progress. I've got a bit of a workstation set up with the wiring tools and my laptop with my giant spreadsheet and wiring diagram. I'm starting to work through laying out the wire in the car itself, so I'll move over and see what I've got up to. I started off with the rear half of the chassis harness. It interfaces at the back with the factory sort of lighting harness. I did modify that to strip out everything that we didn't need and added an extra one for the rain light that we run for motorsport here, and that ends up a connector over on that wheel well. So I've then run all the wires from the PDM out through the back there. You can see each wire's got little identification colours on it, little coloured bands of heat shrink. That all matches up with the colours in my spreadsheet, so I know which wire is which, instead of just a sea of red or white wires as we go through. Just in case you're interested, red means power, white is sort of signal, or pretty much anything. Green is signal ground, orange is sensor 5 volt supply, and a few other bits like that. Just a basic sort of setup so I know what's going on. So the way I did all this is I've got these stick-on cable tie mounts and just loosely ran a cable tie through it, and that lets me sort of route all the wiring where it needs to go, and then once it's all in the final position, I come along and using this sort of capped on tape, group it all together neatly and tightly to make sure that it all runs pretty smooth and doesn't sort of wave around a bit. So that's the rear half of the chassis harness all run. Comes up here and either goes to the main branch point or directly into the PDM. There's a few bits down there that go to there. The next step for that would be to sort of take the harness out of the car and then probably up until about here, sheath it in the sort of braided covering, and also terminate it. So once it lays back in the car, put the connectors on which go to the various bits and pieces that it connects to, get it all plugged in and then secured properly in those cable tie mounts. I may or may not do that though. I might actually run the rest of the chassis harness, which runs up underneath the dash to the sort of steering wheel area. So that covers like the dash display, the clutch switch, a few bits and pieces like that. I've also run all the battery cables, as you saw last time, so they're still in the way and not looking great, but it is what it is. So we can't do too much about it. And I have run the extras, the PDM grounds as well now, so that it'll all run to that same grounding point over there. That's about it for now. I'm not bothering to film what I'm actually doing because it's quite boring. I'm just sort of clambering around the car, running wire after wire, sort of individually. It takes quite a long time. But yeah, I'll just keep checking in on progress as we keep going. Okay, back again with another update. Spent the last few hours running all the dash wiring. So there's a whole bunch that runs underneath the dash up on the firewall, over towards the steering wheel. So we have a clutch switch, the drive-by-wire throttle pedal, some sort of power that's going to like a little USB hub I'm going to run by the keypad, steering angle sensor provision, and also a warning light which will be going in there. Not too many in that section, but a giant pain in the ass because of positioning. So basically I was on my back for 2 hours straight running all those. Not very fun. That completes, I guess, the wire runs for the interior part of the harness. I do need to do everything across from the ECU and the PDM to the bulkhead connectors. I might do that now so I can actually finish off this part of the harness. But yeah, I'll keep working on it. Again, it's pretty boring to see me contorting myself in the car running wiring, so I'll just do some check-ins each time I've got some progress. And after a few more hours of work, the chassis side of the wiring is all run and ready to go. So obviously nothing's terminated yet, you can just see it all runs to either the bulkhead connectors or the ECU and PDM connectors. Now what I need to do is make sure it's all taped up and cable tied in the right spots so it doesn't fall apart, and then take it out of the car so I can sheath it up and get it ready to, you know, crimp all the pins on and get that ready to plug in. So I'll start on that now and we'll check in once that's done. Okay, so I just spent a bit of time cleaning up the interior loom after I got it out of the car. So a lot of that was crimping together a bunch of the shared wires, stuff like sensor ground and sensor plus 5 volt supply. Also just sort of went through how all the branches are run and just made sure they're reinforced with cable ties and stuff for strain relief, and just double checked everything that was there, make sure it's in the right spot. So looks a lot neater than what it was in the car. This is where it goes to the bulkhead connectors. I'll do those last. And this is where it matches up with the ECU plugs, and this is where it matches up with the PDM plugs. So what I want to do now is get some braided sleeving on and heat shrink to secure that in each location. So I'll do that now. Okay, so I finished sheathing up and terminating the interior harness for the most part. What I have left to do is the bulkhead connectors. So before I get onto those, I need to test fit this in the car and get the exact length between the ECU plugs and the bulkheads, just to make sure I'm trimming that at the right spot. And then I'll mock it all up on this table, mount the bulkheads on the table and put them all in there. Turned out pretty decent. So over here, this is the harness that runs over to the steering wheel side of the car. So we've got the throttle position sensor, indicator, clutch switch, and a couple of things to feed the dash and the warning light. Over here, this is the harness that runs to the rear of the car. So we've got the fuel pump and the main tank, rear shock pot sensors, rear lights, that sort of thing. It's all just sheathed up in sort of this high temperature braid, then with glue lined heat shrink on all the joins. And over in this bit, got the main ground, where it even goes to the ground point where the battery is. Other side indicator, PDM plugs here. This goes off to the CAN hub to distribute CAN amongst the car. These plugs here are 2 big power circuits actually for the heated windscreen. So I've got a windscreen that has like sort of little tungsten wire heating elements embedded inside it. So that way I don't need like a blower when it's raining. So there'll be a future when that's fitted up. And got the CAN connection to the ECU as well. And these are the ECU plugs. The only one I don't have is I was missing a DTP4 connector. I forgot to order it for the third VCU connector. This is the power circuits out of the VCU to run like the main fuel pump and the radiator fan and stuff. So that's coming soon. That's pretty easy to crimp on. Through this bit, I've learned some good lessons. Like I've said before, this is the first time that I've done any of the wiring at this sort of level before. So the design of all this routing didn't turn out particularly great. I've kind of got too many things happening in too many places, and I needed to make it cleaner for next time. But I did manage to find at the local Bunnings some kind of like split braided loom. So that way I could kind of just slip it over rather than having to ship it on from the end, because that wasn't going to work because there's too many branches in the way. So good enough for the interior of the car. It's probably not heat rated like the proper braided sheathing is for the engine bay, but the engine bay harness is designed differently and better, and should all be able to be sort of run back to one point without having like a stranded run of wires in the middle. Same deal for this. I'm going to have to get some split braided looming and just sort of slip it over as we go around, but I'll do that once everything's terminated on the bulkheads and ready to go. So next up, I'll get this test fitted in the car, measure up the bulkhead, get that trimmed, get that crimped and terminated, and then that interior harness is complete. There's a lot of work in this. I've probably got like 20 or 30 hours just into this one piece, but I'm learning a lot as I go, and hopefully it'll be a lot quicker for doing the engine bay side of things. Alright, that's us done for the interior harness. So terminated both of the bulkhead connectors, got the boots heat shrink down onto those. Everything's wrapped up, so yeah, got the last little bit of sheathing on. It's all pretty tidy and ready to go. For a first attempt, pretty happy with that. I deliberately did the interior harness first because I think the engine bay harness is more important, being in a hot environment. So I know a bit more about what I'm doing for that one. But yeah, that's probably a good 30 hours of work just to get that together. There's so much involved in this. But definitely will be a lot faster the next time I do it. Anyway, we'll get that in the car, all mounted up and secured and ready to go, and then eventually we'll kick into the engine bay harness. Okay, and installed in the car. So we've got the bulkheads going through into the engine bay, top one for the engine, bottom one for the chassis. ECU connectors, PDM connectors, all the battery powers and grounds, and then the isolator. The harness runs underneath the dash over towards the steering column. You can see I've mounted up my AIM Solo 2 as an interim dash. It'll do a good enough job, and I've got a warning light on top of that. So that warning light will sort of flash at me when I set some ECU parameters that something's going majorly wrong, and that can tell me to turn the car off. Back through the car, harness runs down the side. Connects up to the fuel pump, connects up to the fuel level sender. I've got some plugs back there for rear shock potentiometers in the future. And then we also run up to the back there where we connect into the rear light circuit. So yeah, that's all done now. Time to move on to engine bay. Okay, so next up was the engine bay harness for the B bulkhead connector, which is the chassis side of it, not the engine side of it. Didn't really bother filming me putting it together, but it's all finished now. Turned out a lot better than the interior harness, mainly because I've got practice now, so it's all good. There was one minor stuff up. I accidentally joined both indicators on the same circuit, which is not good because you want to indicate left or right. So I just had to run a separate wire down to that to replace that. So this is the bulkhead connector where it joins up to the firewall. Heading out to fuel pump wiring, brake pressure switches, windscreen wiper, left headlights, left indicator, LED light bar for when I do nighttime events, radiator fan, which I haven't terminated yet because I'm waiting on a connector to arrive, the factory horn, right hand headlights, right hand indicator, and an allowance for the right hand shock travel sensor at the front. Getting slightly quicker at it, still a lot. There's probably like 20 hours in this. So next up, I'll try and get a time lapse on of me laying out the engine harness, and yeah, we'll go from there. Okay, so let me just explain what was just happening on the time lapse there. Firstly, we can see that I've installed the chassis part of the harness, so that all runs up to the various places. Headlights are connected, got a horn, etc. That's all in there nicely now. So for the engine harness itself, I've only done part of it, just the part that runs up over the engine block into the coils. You'll see me first start over at the desk. So here I have my harness layout, and I'm essentially just going branch by branch. So for this bit I started with the oil pressure and temperature transmitter, then VTEC solenoid, VTC solenoid, crank position sensor, then the 4 coils. So that's everything covered by the harnesses in the car at the moment. On the screen, each of those things has a little colour code as to what colour the wire should be and what colour the little idents are. These are the little idents, they're little wee bits of heat shrink. So based on the coding in the spreadsheet, I'm adding a couple of those to the wire, whichever colour and size it needs to be. Once I've done that, I'll come back over to the car, and you would have seen me physically run the wire through the car. So starting at the bulkhead connector and then running out to where it needs to go, and then just masking tape it in place at its final location, and then trimming it back at the bulkhead connector to make sure the length is correct. Now when planning the harness, I did measure all the lengths and lay it out with rope in the car, but I didn't do a very good job of it, so I've been doing just sort of the lengths in the vehicle as we go, which is a lot slower. If I'd planned it properly at the start, I can just build it all on the bench and install it. But this way I know it's correct, and it allowed me to fix a few mistakes on the way through as well. So essentially, starting down at the sensors, and then down the bottom we have the oil pressure temperature sensor. Up here we have the VTEC solenoid. Here we have the VTC solenoid. And obviously the crank trigger, crank position sensor is down by the crank pulley. And then we've got the 4 coils. So I just repeated that process for each of those wires, just running them all individually, ticking them off on my spreadsheet, making sure they're identified correctly. And I've just got the colours marked on masking tape there at the bulkhead. So when the time comes for the final trim and termination into the bulkhead connector, I can put the right coloured identifications on those too. But yeah, that's really it. It's just sort of, once I've done each sensor from each branch point, I use this special Teflon tape. This stuff here, it's really expensive, it's like $30 a roll. But it's super thin and really nice and easy to use and heat resistant. So each grouping of wire is taped together to keep it all nice and neat. So individual sensors are all there, and then that's grouped together at one branch point in this location here. That same branch then runs all the way back down to here. This will be another main branch point where the ignition coils will split off from all that sensor and solenoid wiring, and there'll be a lot more wiring going around the rest of the engine bay from that same branch point, which I'll do later. Next section is the ignition coils wiring, so that's one big thick power cable which will get spliced into thinner individual power cables to power each coil, and then also the 4 coil triggers here as well. What I haven't done yet, and what I'll just do next, is the grounds for each of those coils. They'll just be sort of 4 individual grounds, and then I'll tap them into just a little ring terminal here on the head. Yeah, so hopefully that's a somewhat ample explanation of what I'm doing when I'm laying out the harness. This is the 3rd one I've done, so I've done the interior of the car, the chassis side of the engine bay harness, and now I'm doing the engine side of the engine bay harness. So kind of got the hang of it. But like I said, it's still slow going. And not making too many mistakes, which is good, but there's lots of checks and double checks as we go along the way. Anyway, I won't bother with any more time lapse because it's just the same thing. We'll check in once I've laid out the rest of the engine harness. And now we're done with the engine harness. It was actually quite simple to lay out. I think because it's such a linear harness, there's only sort of 2 real branch points on this. The big one down there and a couple of minor ones. Compared to the interior, which went absolutely everywhere, and the chassis side of the engine bay, which also goes absolutely everywhere and has some annoying places to get to. Everything laid out pretty nice. You can see like intake air temperature just temporarily there until I get an intake. Throttle body, all the injectors, fuel pressure sensor, got like starter solenoid wiring and knock sensor, all the various bits like the vehicle speed sensor, reverse indicator, reverse lockout solenoid, all sorts going on. But yeah, that all laid out pretty nice. So I've now grouped it up, taped it, put cable ties where the branch points are. Now I'll take it out of the car and start putting the braiding on that in the heat shrink to sheath that up ready for termination. Alright, so after a lot of work, the engine harness is now all sheathed up, terminated and ready to get installed. Just sort of running you through what we do for that. Each individual branch is sort of covered in this high temperature nylon braided sort of sleeving. Just have a little bit of glue lined heat shrink which secures that at each end. I just put on a bit of a label for what it is. There's sort of, you can get heat shrink which is printable in those little label printers. So this is the vehicle speed sensor plug. I bought a whole bunch of new plugs from NRT Automotive, so they're just like a replacement K-series engine set. So all new coil plugs and injector plugs, everything you need. So I just went through the harness bit by bit. There's only sort of a couple of major branch points. This first one here off the main harness, which then splits off into all these different ones. And then a couple other little branch points, like for example in the injector harness, where you can sort of see that one branch point goes up to the different injectors. Down on this end I've got the bulkhead connector which interfaces with the connector on the firewall that has a boot on it, as well as some glue line heat shrink to secure that. So really hoping that it all fits nicely in the car. What I found with the other harnesses that I've done so far is once everything's sort of sheathed and heat shrinked up, kind of shrinks a little bit and it's a bit tougher to get some of the connectors in, so I've made sure I added extra length for this one. Hopefully that works. So yeah, now I'll get that installed into the car and show you once it's all in there and secured. And there we have it, all installed. You can see the bulkhead comes out of the firewall, running down along the shifter cables and splits off into the various places it needs to go. So a few connectors around the gearbox. Still got one left over. I'm waiting for another replacement connector to come in. It's just a reverse sensor, pretty easy to do later on. Also just got the intake air temperature just sitting there for now. Once I get an intake fabricated, obviously that will be part of that. But yeah, everything else is run and pretty much sorted. Got the fuel injectors up here, coils up here, throttle body, a few bits under the intake manifold for like the NOx sensor and the alternator, and things like the oil pressure and temperature sensor, VTEC solenoid, VTC solenoid, and crank sensor, which I'll plug in later once I jack the car up. The extra length that I added did work quite well. Everything fits quite nicely, so pretty happy with that. But yeah, for a first attempt, pretty stoked. Also chucked in a tow loop. Seems to be a nice easy place to put it in the engine bay there, rather than sort of having to run it through the bumper. Yeah, so sum total of that's like a good 150 hours work involved in planning the harness, which is I showed in the previous video, and doing all of this build and install, which is this video. It's a really intense amount of time. I've been trying to work like 20-30 hours a week on this, so it probably took me about 2 odd months to get through all that. Massive undertaking. I learned a heap. By the time I got to that last engine harness there, I think I'd sort of got the hang of it pretty well good. But you know, if there's a next time, I'll be in a lot better position to smash this out a lot quicker. So yeah, huge amount of work. That'll probably wrap it up for this video. What I'll do next is I'll just do a few other little tidy up bits in the engine bay, just routing bits and pieces, making sure they're not touching the hot engine block and that sort of thing, and get it ready for first startup. That also needs me to build like an ECU base map and set up all the PDM, so I'll start working on that next, and that'll be covered in the next video. But yeah, I'm exhausted after that wiring. I'm really glad it's all done. I actually booked in for a dyno tune in about 3 weeks time, so not long to go. But yep, I'll carry on and hopefully we'll get it started up next time. Thanks for watching. See you later.